Okay, well then what I'll do is I'll review a little bit before we got 5 minutes. So I will introduce myself and I'll say 2 or 3 sentences about the standards and how they've come, that they exist and they've come about. And that we're going to spend the next 20 or 30 minutes talking about the standards, and that my guests today are, and then I'll introduce you, Janice, and you, Mary, and welcome you. And then Mary, I think we'll just start with you, and I'll say, Mary, I'd like to start with you. Why new standards now? Why have standards for this topic when we already have PLES? Talk to us a little bit about that, and that'll kind of kick us off. We'll cover the topics we talked about last week. I think we'll talk about, not necessarily in this order, we'll see how things evolve, but Janice, I'd like to come to you to talk to you about what excites you about the standards, and we talked a little bit about that last week. Mary will talk about, you may cover it when the first question about how the standards were created, but who was involved, what was the research base, and if you don't cover that in the first question, that's okay, I'll come to it. Then Janice and Mary, I'll ask you both about why prep programs and the professors who teach in them should be concerned about these standards. Janice, I'd like to ask you about how these standards could be applied to different types of districts. We talked about that a little bit last week. You thought like standard 4 was particularly useful for just about anybody. And then we'll probably talk about, I might ask, I'm a school leader, what do I do if I want to take these on? What's the thought process a district might engage in to think about bringing these on? And then anything else you think of along the way, I'm pleased to speak about. But those are the main points, if that sounds okay.
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 Great.
John, you had said there was one. I think there is one question that you missed. You talked about how can it be applied to different settings.
Oh, how can these standards be applied to different types of district settings? I think, yeah, that's better. Yeah. Thank you. Would that
and
be
before
better?
that, you were talking sort of.
Go ahead. Did you remember?
I can't remember. You mentioned something about
prep programs.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Okay. Like, why should they care about this?
Yeah. Why should professors and prep programs and the program be, should they be aware of these standards? Yes, I think probably is fair to say. But how should they be thinking about this as they prepare new principals and superintendents, for that matter? I think there's application of these for principal prep, but also superintendent and supervisor prep.
You start in a second. Are you good?
Really good. Cool, ma'am.
Okay. Marcy, I'm going to hide you from the broadcast.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hi, Marcy.
She'll be back. So she's watching us, but she's not, hidden from broadcast. Let me shut my door. Okay, almost ready. All right, here we go. Ready?
Ready?
All right. Hi, I'm John Nash at the University of Kentucky. I'm also the Associate Director for Communications for the University Council for Educational Administration. Welcome to Café UCEA. In 2015, several organizations collaborated to release the professional standards for educational leaders, or the former Interstate School Leadership Licensure Consortium standards, better known as the ISLIC standards. And this is the first ever Model Principal Supervisor Professional Standards in 2015, authored by the CCSSO, accompanied that release. And funds from the Wallace Foundation supported both of those projects. Now, these new Principal Supervisor Standards were created to ensure principals receive close support as they pursue teaching and learning goals in their schools. The standards seek to de-emphasize compliance-related tasks and focus a supervisor's responsibility as a coach and on developing their principals as instructional leaders. So today I'm joined by two guests who are going to talk to us a little bit more about this for the next 20 or 30 minutes. You can participate during our live presentation by watching this on YouTube. You can type a question or comment in the chat on the right side of the screen, and we'll do our best to answer it during the show. My guests today are Dr. Janie Harris, who is an instructional superintendent for Cluster 5 in the District of Columbia Public Schools. Dr. Harris is currently implementing the standards with her principals. And I'm also joined today by Dr. Mary Canole, currently an educational consultant and recently with CCSSO, where she worked to develop the standards. And we'll talk today about how that process went. So Janice, Janice and Mary, welcome to Café UCEA.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Mary, I'd like to start with you. Why new standards now? Why have standards for this particular topic when we have PLES, which were the former ISLIC standards?
Well, John, I know it's a hard pill to swallow. I don't think people love to have lots of different standards documents, but we felt that principals really are under an awful lot of pressure right now to be instructional leaders in their school. And quite frankly, with the accountability system the way it was, and even moving forward, the principal is always the first to go when improvement suffers in the school. So I believe that what districts are wanting to do now more than ever before is to show their support to principals and not leave them stranded on their own. So although the new professional standards for educational leaders speak to much of the work of principal supervisors as well, we wanted to call it out separately because we feel that this role in central office needs to change so that principals, in fact, get the support that they need. You know, you mentioned in your opening that central office is primarily focused on compliance, looking at state and federal regulations, and really looking to to determine whether the school is complying with everything. So they're calling principals all the time asking for reports, and yet the principal may not get that important feedback that they need about their practice to move up to that next level of effectiveness in their schools.
So Janice, you are currently implementing this. If I understand it correctly, you're one of 10 superintendents covering over 100 schools in the DC public schools, and this is now underway. What excites you about this? Because I get the sense that this is a different approach than what's been put in play before.
Well, over the last several years, I think we've been working towards moving away from that compliance-driven supervision and really thinking about the balance between coaching and supervision. So helping principals get to the work of instructional leadership, we have to provide them support, as Mary said. And I think the standards have allowed us sort of an opportunity, a vehicle to develop a strategic framework in pursuit of that.
Mary, can you talk a little bit more about how the standards were created? Who was involved? Is there a research base behind this?
Sure. Well, first, I think it's important to understand what was happening in the context at the time. The Wallace Foundation actually approached CCSSO and the National Policy Board for Ed Administration and asked if we thought the time was right to what they called at the time refresh the ISLIC standards. And when we were having that conversation, we also said, well, you know, if you're doing the ISLIC standards, you should also do the educator prep standards as well, because usually they're out of sync. They're, you know, one's not aligned to the other. So we kind of got agreement on that through all bodies. But then Wallace came back and said, well, you know, since you're doing those two, what about doing principal supervisors? And we were like, oh my goodness, is this going to be overload for the field? So CCSSO, a colleague of mine, Irv Richardson, and myself engaged with Andy Cole of the Wallace Foundation, and we did a lot of research review as far as what was out there, you know, pertaining to principal supervisors. And what we found is, depending on the district, it looked different, depending on context. And there's, you know, a zillion different names, it seems, for the role of principal supervisors. Some places call them instructional superintendents, some zone superintendents, area soups, leadership directors, and the list goes on and on. And what we found from the research was that we wanted to make sure that the standards themselves actually could be used as a lever to transform the practice of central office. So what we found particularly were research from great city schools that talked about all these deficiencies in this role of principal supervisor. They had too big of a caseload. The work looked different depending on you know, what district the principal supervisor was in. And then we came across some research from the University of Washington, some of Meredith Honig's work, that actually suggested that if you support principal supervisors in their support of principals, then by and large it starts a chain reaction whereby teachers get what they need and students ultimately get what they need. So there was a link to student improvement. And, you know, although it's, it wasn't, it's still being proven now in the research with all of the work that District of Columbia schools are doing and the rest of the districts in the Wallace Foundation network of principal supervisors. We're trying to get explicit data to prove that there is a direct link to student improvement, but we feel that it's there. The new data that we're latching on to now is really, I would imagine that in a year or so, we'll be able to prove that. The other thing we did, in addition to the research base, was look at practitioners. And we did a lot of focus groups, we did surveys, and what we found was that yes, the instructional leadership piece is a huge piece of the principal supervisor and standards were developed for those, but they also felt that this is going to be a sea change for districts to move to this new role of principal supervisor, which meant they were going to have to take some things off of a principal supervisor's plate, you know, more managerial things so that the principal supervisor could get right into the schools and be there, have a presence there with their principals. So the districts that we surveyed and did focus groups with said that we couldn't just have instructional leadership standards. We had to look at the district itself and what was going on there. The principal supervisor had to serve as a liaison from that school to the district, an advocate for that school, but at the same time also hold the principal accountable for, you know, abiding by district policies and procedures.
Mm-hmm.
And then
So-
finally,
yeah.
we just wanted to make sure also that the principal supervisor got support in this new role from the district. So it required a lot of change on all parties' parts.
So to you, Janice, and kind of a tall order then, looking to create a sea change in the way in which principals, supervisors supervise principals, and then in turn, hopefully help schools succeed. Talk to us a little bit about what that looks like in practice. What kinds of changes, if any, are you seeing as this gets put in play? You're in schools more perhaps than you used to be, or maybe your colleagues were prior to you. What sorts of attitude changes or other outcomes do you see amongst your principals? What can you say about any of this?
Well, first of all, I think it's really exciting to be in DC Public Schools because of their commitment to my development as a principal supervisor. So every week I spend an entire day, my supervisor plans professional development for me. I'm able to sit with my colleagues, sometimes just the elementary level, and sometimes all of us across K-12, all 10 of us will sit together, and we're able to really delve into the standards. This summer, for example, we had an instructional superintendent retreat, and we used the standards as a, you know, we were able to really delve in and think about the high leverage actions that we need to take on as principal supervisors to support our principals. There are a lot of demands on the principals. And, you know, as Mary said, they're probably held the most accountable of any position in the district for student achievement. And so just being a supervisor and not support in helping them get to that goal is not going to help the system move forward. And so we talked extensively as an instructional superintendent team about really what is our role in supporting our principals in meeting the major initiatives that we've put forth as a district, and exactly what can we do to support. And so that looks like, how do we provide a professional development plan for the year in our cluster meetings to ensure that the principals are getting the information that they need, the time, the support, the space to think together, support one another in this work, and you know, sometimes just time away from the campus to think. We also think about how does that and these standards really impact our thinking around our one-on-one meetings. When we go to our site visits with our principals, you know, the first standard talks about helping them grow as instructional leaders. Are we doing as principal supervisors to promote that? And so this year, last year I had 12 schools, and this year we added an additional superintendent. So I have 10 schools, and I can tell you that I have been able to be in my schools maybe 4 times in a month. In some, for my new principals, I've been able to be in their schools a couple times a week even. And the focus is not just, okay, principal, tell me what you're doing. It's really been, well, let's sit down and see, well, what are the things that you're challenged with now at this time, you know, this week, this time of the year, and, you know, how can I support you in addressing that? So it may look like at my next one-on-one visit, I will bring someone from the Office of Teaching and Learning to do a joint walkthrough with me to look at English language arts classrooms or mathematics instruction. I may have someone, recently I had the social worker supervisor and the psychology supervisor come in and do a walk and help think through some issues of behavioral support. So it's not just sort of the moment of the one-to-one, but it's also leveraging the resources of the district and bringing it to bear to, in the school where that busy principal does not have time to make 10 calls to figure out how they can get help. And so I think in taking a deep dive into the standards, we have been able to be much more strategic about our work and really begin to think even more so than even a couple years ago when I started. I think we're thinking more so about that shared accountability and sort of what is the role of the instructional superintendent or principal supervisor in ensuring that principals feel absolutely supported and want to continue. I mean, this is about leadership sustainability. And I think my role is pivotal in the longevity of my principals in this work.
This is Café UCEA, and my guests are Dr. Janie Harris of DC Public Schools and Dr. Mary Canole, an educational consultant and recently working with CCSSO on the standards that we're talking about today. You can participate during our live program or even afterwards on YouTube. Just type a question or comment in the chat on the right side of the screen, and we'll do our best to answer it now or later when it's online and archived. So I'd like to ask you both a little bit. The standards can be a little daunting. Should they be adopted hook, line, and sinker, or is this more of a start anywhere, go everywhere? Are there parts that can be applied sooner than later if someone was interested in trying to adopt these?
Well, John, I'd like to start if that's okay. First of all, I would never recommend that anyone adopt standards hook, line, or sinker. The beauty of standards is really all of the discussion that takes place around them. And these standards may or may not apply to every single school or district context. So it's important to go through the standards and really see what can serve as a lever in your district to get to that next step of more definition for this role of principal supervisor so principals can get what they need. I think it's important. Many districts may decide they want to write their own, but these are a good starting point for them. And I think the other thing that people need to know is that there is a subset of standards in these 8 standards that are quite similar and virtually identical to the University of Washington's Principal Supervisor Performance Standards. The first 4 standards are all about instructional leadership. Those standards are the view of University of Washington that this is the only work a principal supervisor should do. And if districts believe that, they know that they can't just make that happen overnight. So there's other standards that need to be in place that will help a district grow from going from that compliance organization to a support organization that they need to have in place. And one of them is making sure, like Janice just said, there are others in central office that have to start engaging with principals and taking some things off of the plate of the principal supervisor, whether it's parent or community issue that the principal supervisor would normally take on. Now there would be somebody else in central office that would be doing that. Perhaps it's an issue of budget, where perhaps the business manager comes and meets with that principal. So really, this whole change in job description for principal supervisors serves as a catalyst of change for the district as itself. But the standards may or may not work for every single district. If I'm a small district and it's just me, the superintendent, then I have to add on these standards to everything else that I do in my daily responsibilities. It may not be practical, and I may have to delegate to other folks that are not principal supervisors, but could help in a coaching role to principals. So the standards are what you make of them. They're wonderful guidelines for discussion. And ultimately, it's the hope that districts would aspire to be able to implement all of the standards. But they need the capacity to do that and the readiness to do that. So you first have to start with conversation.
Janice?
So I think it's about going for the low-hanging fruit here, right? And so Standard 4, for example, talks about the principal supervisor engaging principals in the formal district evaluation process, growth-oriented way. I'm paraphrasing. And so every system has some sort of process. And, you know, a really sort of small first step that the district can take is to say, well, how can I use this evaluation process in a more collaborative way that actually meets the needs of the principal, that really identifies and differentiates the professional learning that this principal needs in order to be successful. And so just thinking about the professional development and growth of the individual principal through the evaluation system can be an easy place to start.
Very good, very good. I can't help but think that there might be implications for leader preparation programs. And I'd like to ask you both a little bit about that. To the extent that preparation programs and the professors who teach in them should be aware of the standards or be thinking about integrating them into their work, what is your